Hello, so today we're going to start looking at second language acquisition theories, and we're not going to make it too technical. The idea really is just to have a general overview. Lots of teachers have a lot of knowledge about second language acquisition theories, and some teachers maybe don't have very much explicit knowledge, but there are things that they intuitively feel, and in the way that they've probably taught and ideas that they've got from colleagues and so on, there are probably lots of elements of second language acquisition theory which they do in fact apply to their teaching and to their classes. So the idea here really is to get a general overview of some of these theories and to reflect on how they can inform our teaching. So first of all, we have behaviorism. And these are based on the ideas of behavioral psychologists like the famous Russian one, Pavlov. And he showed how a dog could be made to associate the ringing of a bell with food. And Skinner took these ideas and expanded them and applied them to the learning of a language. And he emphasized the importance of reinforcement, positive reinforcement or rewards of the desired language behavior, i.e. correct language, and the kind of punishment of undesirable behavior. And what he thought was that this model explained language development. So he argued for breaking tasks down into small sequential steps and programming learning by providing positive reinforcement, lots of positive reinforcement. And the idea is, I mean, it has big limitations because it suggests that language is learned only by imitation, which makes you think, well, so how did the first people learn language? Who were they imitating? It takes the idea that a child or a language learner is a tabula rasa, which is like a blank slate, so like an empty page, and suggests that language is nurture, so language is conditioning, rather than something that the learner learns for themselves. And it's a theory which has limitations, but it's very common around the world still. It's had a big influence on the way languages are taught. In the kind of companies which use language laboratories, you'll see a methodology based on this idea of language learning. Also, you get lots of repetition and drilling and substitution activities. For example, for prepositions, the pen is on the table, everybody repeats. The pen is under the table, everybody repeats. The book is next to the phone, the picture is next to the phone, and we get this kind of substitution. So this is was kind of one of the first significant theories about how we acquired language, but it's kind of out of fashion, and it's been decided more or less that this isn't really the way we learn languages today. If we only learn by repetition and imitation, how is it that children make very logical mistakes that they've never heard an adult say? I've already given you a few little clues about this, but this is your first question for reflection. The innatist perspective is where this starts to get interesting. It was definitely a reaction against the behaviorist approach. And it's much more encouraging because the idea is that learners are actually using their brains to find patterns. They're hypothesizing, they're analyzing, they're deducing information. So their minds are actively involved in the learning process. So yeah, they have to identify patterns, work out rules, and experiment, take chances. And also making mistakes is something that's considered to be an important part of the learning process. And there are kind of two schools of thought in this innatist approach. The first one, and really the big name here, is Noam Chomsky. And he thought that there was a specific part of the brain that was common to all of us, that was specifically dedicated to learning languages. And we had this language learning ability built into us. And this has had an enormous influence on language teaching, although really there are no specific teaching methodologies that have been based on this assumption. The other school of thought is that really we use our general cognitive functions, the ones we use to complete other tasks and learn other things in life, and those are the ones that we also apply to learning languages. So it is the same skills of looking for patterns and arriving at conclusions and so on. So a typical lesson based on this kind of innatist cognitive approach, the teacher might ask students to analyze a text, to analyze some language, and to try to identify which language structures are included there and how they're being used, so that the students can arrive at their own conclusions and use their minds to learn the language. So yeah, this is starting to get a little bit more interesting than the behaviorist approach. It's not perfect, it's not without critics. There have been lots of theories since then, but it starts to better explain, even if only in a partial way, how we actually learn languages, or at least one of the ways in which we learn languages. More than a question, here's an interesting little task to do. There is a difference between the two lists of words, and most people generally find one list easier to remember than the other. So try and do the task, see how you do, and speculate on what happened and why. For constructivists, people are involved throughout their whole lives, really, in constructing their own knowledge. And we do this from how we personally understand experiences. And everybody does this in their own unique way. So you've probably experienced this, for example. If at the end of a lesson you ask your students what they've learned, they'll all tell you something which is completely different, because they've all experienced it and constructed meaning in their own particular individual way. And excuse me, the work of Piaget was particularly influential in the development of constructivist ideas, and these ideas have important implications for language teachers. As learners are exposed to language, to new language, they incorporate this new knowledge into what they already know, into their existing knowledge, and this means that they modify what they already know. Bruner was another important figure in constructivist ideas, and he argued that learners need to know how to learn and to develop their cognitive capacities by being absorbed in challenging and meaningful problems. So they need to make guesses, speculate, use intuition, take risks, have curiosity, but they also need to feel confident in their ability to solve problems. An extension of this idea is that we are continually creating and testing hypotheses, and this is how we learn. We either refute our hypotheses, or we arrive at the conclusion that we're right based on our experience and the knowledge that we've constructed. So a teacher who follows a kind of constructivist line might start a lesson by eliciting personal or emotional responses from learners, and also, things that they maybe already know about a topic, and this might be organized in a visual way, and then they'll be provided with opportunities to create new knowledge with the foundation of what they already know. So that basically is constructivism, the idea that through experience we construct our own reality, again using our brains, but in a specific context in which we find ourselves. Here's something else for you to think about. Does this kind of learning suit everybody? And do you have any experience of this? Humanistic approaches emphasize the importance of considering the whole person when learning. So their individuality and the important role that their feelings and emotions play. And Maslow formed this hierarchy. And what he suggests is, what he argues is that it's very difficult to fulfill the higher order needs if we don't have the lower order needs fulfilled. So if we start at the very bottom, obviously, if your students don't have the physiological needs, the food, the water, warmth, the rest, then they're probably not even going to be in class. So they're the basic kind of survival needs. And then after that, the need to feel secure. And then beyond that, the needs are not necessarily essential for survival, but if we're looking for developing the student's self-esteem and then actually getting them to fulfill their potential and to be able to learn, then we obviously need a very strong basic and psychological foundation. So teachers really need to, taking this into account, they need to create a safe, secure, productive, happy learning environment. So a humanistic teacher might start a class by getting learners to focus on a partner and imagining how that partner feels, or by closing their eyes and visualizing something, or by taking a very affective and emotional route in and asking them to explore their own feelings, or doing some kind of activity to get them into a positive frame of mind. So it goes well beyond just the cognitive here. Humanism looks at the whole person and focuses holistically on the whole person, takes the whole individual into account. What do you think about this? Is the affective side in opposition to the cognitive side? Are they mutually complementary? Is one more important than the other? What do you think? It's easy to see how this is an extension of earlier theories of language acquisition. The thing is here that socio-cultural perspectives do not separate the individual from the context in which they're learning. It sees learning as essentially a social process in which there is a double direction, really. The social context has an impact on the individual, but the individual, by participating, also influences the social context. So you can imagine in the situation of a class, you might have 12 people in a class and one very dominant personality or somebody with very particular characteristics. And on the day that that student doesn't come to class, maybe the whole dynamic of the class changes. I'm sure you've experienced this. So big name here, Vygotsky was one of the most influential psychologists in the area. And other writers have applied his ideas specifically to language learning, to the learning of a foreign language, and indeed the mother tongue. Learning happens when the individual, when the student, the learner, is faced with something that's a little bit beyond their current level of mastery, a little bit beyond what they can do. So here it's important to take into account peers and teachers and parents who are a little bit or a lot above the current level of the learner, and they can use scaffolding to help the learner get to the next level. This space between what the student or the learner can do at the moment and what they're able to do with some help is called the zone of proximal development, and this is quite famous in educational circles. So students are often working in groups, discussing, negotiating, and while they're doing cognitive tasks, they're interacting with other people and verbalizing what they're doing. So there's a metacognitive element here, and they're using mental processes such as memory, decision making, problem solving, and things like this. So in a class which has been informed by sociocultural theory, teachers will be scaffolding learners to reach the next level of ability, and they'll tend to encourage learners to work in groups and communicate with each other as they're conducting tasks. And they'll also be pushed to discuss how they are learning in order that they can become more conscious of this. And now there's another question for your consideration. Again, thinking a little bit about your personal experience. So now we've come to the time for you to really do some work. You have here 4 different classroom scenarios, and what you have to do is to analyze the activities which are described and to try and decide what the key characteristics of each of those classrooms is, and also identify the psychological perspectives, the second language acquisition theory perspectives that we've been talking about in this video, and see how they are reflected in these activities. And in some of them there is something of an overlap, so it's not necessarily just one. And finally, when you've done that, what you need to do now is to imagine that you're the teacher of the class carrying out these activities. Now, some of them you maybe feel have pedagogical or teaching value, and some of them perhaps not so much. And some of them you might like, and some of them you might not like. Now, this is not exactly the same thing, because some activities that we might think are good teaching activities are ones that we ourselves are not comfortable with doing because of our own personality and the things that we like to do or don't like to do in the classroom. I often find myself that I ask my students to do things that I wouldn't enjoy doing myself, but I do them because I think maybe they would enjoy them, and also maybe that they are effective learning strategies, even though the way I learn might be quite different from the way that they do. So that really is a nice way to finish this video. I'm not suggesting that any of the explanations of how we would learn languages is perfect. In fact, there is currently no agreement on really how we learn languages, but it seems that there are elements we can take from each of these methodologies which contribute towards effective language teaching. So the idea really here was for you to learn a little bit more about these perspectives and reflect and think about how they can inform you and your teaching in the future.